Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Liam Clear, and I'm Senior Manager for Research, Analytics and Impact here at UCD. We're delighted to welcome you all to the Engaged Research Seminar series brought to you by UCD Research. Today, we explore the growing popularity of participatory action research, or PAR, and other forms of community engaged research, and what this means for ethical practice. We are delighted to welcome Sarah Banks, Professor Emerita in the Department of Sociology and co-founder of the Centre for Social Justice and Community Action at Durham University. Sarah teaches and researches in the fields of participatory action research, community development, and social work ethics. She has a particular interest in practical ethics and has co-authored and co-edited a number of books on the topic. We are delighted she can join us today to share her insights and experience with engaged research and community resilience. So the talk today will last about 30 to 40 minutes and will be followed by questions and answers. You'll notice that there is a button down at the bottom of the screen for questions and answers. And if you think of anything as we go through the talk, please feel free to add in questions as we go along. So Sarah, over to you. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you very much, Liam. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm sorry it's only virtual. I would love to be in Dublin in person, but maybe one day soon I'll get there. But in the meantime, we're together virtually. And what I'll do now is just share the slides and do a short presentation as Liam indicated. So just share the screen. And is that all looking okay, Liam?
All good. Ready to go.
Okay, I'll just get rid of the floating meeting controls that always get in the way. All right. So the title is Negotiating the Ethical Space of Participatory Research. So although this is about what I call participatory action research, a lot of the issues apply to engaged research more generally, and that would include any research that works with local communities, voluntary community sector organisations on topics that interest them. So I'll start off by saying a few words about ethics. I'll then talk a bit more about participatory action research, and I'll look at some of the ethical issues that arise in that research and think about what we can do to tackle them and how we can develop our ethical competence and ethical practice. If some of you are philosophers or have studied moral philosophy, you'll know there's all sorts of different definitions and takes on ethics. So this is just my interpretation. It's a fairly broad understanding of ethics as a topic, covering questions about what kind of lives we should lead, what counts as a good society, what actions are right, wrong, what qualities of character we should develop, and what responsibilities we have for each other and the ecosystem. A particularly important factor, I think, as we're increasingly aware now of the impact of climate change on humans and our whole biosphere. So that's what I mean by ethics. Participatory action research, again, those of you who are in the field will know that there's all sorts of different names that we use. This is my take on participatory action research. It's a collaborative effort in which people whose lives might be affected by the issues being researched are partners in all or some of the processes of designing, undertaking, and disseminating research, often with the aim of influencing socially just change. That's the action component. And this definition of participatory action research has the values built into it. In one sense, it's not value neutral. That social justice aim is in there. That may not be true of all forms of participatory research, but this is our approach in Durham's Centre for Social Justice and Community Action. And the process aims to be democratic, participatory, empowering, and educational. And those are fine ideals, aren't they? And as those of you who do this sort of research will know, it's not always easy to live out those ideals, as we shall see shortly. But those are the ideals that we have in place that we attempt to work towards. But as many of you will know, like a lot of research, but particularly this participatory variety of research, it is unpredictable. We don't always know where it's going to lead. We don't know who our community partners will be. The ideas, the plans, the design emerge over time, and so it requires quite a degree of flexibility and creativity. Those of you who are researchers more generally will say, well, that's true of all research. It certainly is, but I think particularly so of participatory research. And the reason I'm here today probably is because participatory research is becoming more and more popular within the university sector. Certainly in the UK, we've had funding from our main UK research funding body, UK Research and Innovation, which is specifically targeted to participatory action research. I'm not sure if you've had that in Ireland. That came as quite a shock because we weren't used to having this specific money. It wasn't a great deal, but it was targeted. So this kind of research is becoming increasingly popular. And partly because it's close to local communities, it's seen to be engaging, and it can have an impact. It may be a small local impact, but there can be bigger impacts as well. So this popularity means there is dangers of poor practice. So a lot of people climbing on the bandwagon, people who probably don't know what it's about, who haven't actually got the skills or time to work really hard to engage local communities and to negotiate ethical approaches to research. There's a need for more scrutiny of this, but at the same time, we're also facing the growing institutional regulation through research ethics committees, which do bring dangers of too much or inappropriate constraints. So I don't know how many of you had experience of going through your research ethics committees with participatory projects, but it sometimes can be quite difficult, particularly if the ethics committee members don't really understand participatory research, and they need to know all your research questions and methods before you even set foot outside the doors of the university. So there's both a need for extra scrutiny, but also at the same time a need for some flexibility. And how do we balance that? How do we negotiate that is a really important issue. And over time, as I've been looking at the ethical issues in participatory research that we've come across in Durham, but also through many networks that I've been part of for quite some time, and many bits of research projects that I've been involved with, I came up with the 4Rs. It's always good to have some alliteration, and 4Rs seemed a good enough one for this purpose. There could be a completely different set of issues, but these are the 4 areas of challenge that I'm going to look at today about the regulation of research, the reach, how far it goes, the relationships involved, and how to report research. There are other areas, and I'll be interested to hear from you about some of the areas of ethical challenge that you experience or anticipate experiencing if you do this sort of research. So thinking about regulation and particularly research ethics review, as I mentioned, sometimes research ethics committees don't understand it. You may be fortunate in UCD, maybe you do have some good research ethics committees in your departments, sections, or however it is you organise the regulation. But often ethics forms don't even mention participatory research. In Durham, we've been doing quite a bit of work with our research ethics coordinator, and the forms have been changed now. So participatory research is on there, and we've run some training on that topic. There's often an assumption that people are either participants, and by participants is meant people who give data, who are subjects or objects of research. And then there's researchers who are the academics who collect the data. And often it's assumed that community-based researchers who may be partners actually are vulnerable, and they're kind of seen as participants, and the university therefore needs to protect them from harm and to protect the reputation of the university, obviously. Often the research ethics committees require the full details of all the design and methods at the start. Again, we are making some headway on that. Often they don't invite staged approvals, which would be a way of dealing with the fact that you can't say exactly what methods you're going to use until you've actually had an initial meeting and set up a community partnership group. Often they don't consider ownership of outputs, or if they do, it's the university that might own the outputs. So how do you handle shared outputs where there might be the university and the community partners involved? And these are often externally imposed institutional concerns, and they're about risk aversity. As opposed to being supportive and encouraging researchers to talk and reflect. And I'll just give an example which actually comes from Ireland. And this comes from a book that I edited with Mary Bryden Miller, which is a book of ethics cases from around the world. I think we have at least 2 good ones from Ireland that I use quite a lot. This one is a palliative care academic who was interested in how all nurses in whatever hospital wards or departments can gain basic palliative care competencies, because obviously often there's people who need palliative care who aren't in a specialist palliative care ward or setting. And she was approached by a respiratory nurse who wanted support to address the palliative care needs of patients with respiratory disease. So the academic, Geraldine was her name is in the book, suggested an action research approach, and a planning group of nurses worked to draft a proposal to set up an action research group of nurses and patients to oversee gathering information and analysis of needs and recommendations for the hospital. And this proposal was submitted to the university's Faculty Research Ethics Committee and was rejected because it included patients who had advanced disease in an action research group, and that would be too onerous for them, and asking patients to engage in a project, the outcome of which was not predetermined in terms of activities and outcomes, activities and time, was not acceptable. So that's an interesting result. And I would be interested to know your views on that. We obviously don't know the full details of this project, but at first sight, you might think, well, yes, of course, it is burdensome for people who have advanced disease to get involved in research. But what if that is what they choose to do? If that is something that they feel would be a useful thing for them to do perhaps in their last days of life, to try to improve conditions for other people, which is often what people do want, then why should the university be so parentalist or protectionist towards them, we might say. And the fact that people could withdraw might mean that if the outcome was not predetermined, people could start and then inevitably they would drop out as time went on. So that's an example where the Research Ethics Committee turned down a particular focus for research. The second area I want to mention is reach. So who is included and excluded in the research, particularly who's included and excluded as partners. So with the academics working in partnership with people in the community. In the last case, it was within a hospital setting. So wanting to not just work with the nurses, but also to work with patients. How do we include the representation of different interests, diversities of views and experience, making sure that we have people from different religions, cultures, neighborhoods, age groups, and so on. Issues about accessibility, both of physical places and digital places. Some of these are more accessible to some than others. How we speak about the research, what language we choose to describe it, to do it, and making sure we have adequate funding to include and pay people. And that's a big issue, which I'm sure some of you will have experience of. It's often assumed if community members are informants that you don't necessarily pay them, or you pay them and give them a £10 gift voucher. But these community members are co-researchers who may themselves be doing interviews, gathering data, writing reports, analysing data. So putting into the proposal from the start enough funding to pay them for all stages of the research. In the book I just mentioned, we have an example where an academic got a very small amount of money, which would pay for people to gather data as researchers, but wouldn't include paying them for analysis and writing up. And so, not surprisingly, the community members didn't want to get involved further. Which leads on to the topic of relationships. In all research, relationships are important, but in this sort of research, relationships are very important because we're trying to aim for a democratic process where academics and community partners can work together. They may not have equal roles, but to work together equitably so that whatever knowledge, skills different people have, they're able to put them into the project and be respected for that. And making sure that we maximize people's participation, that academics don't dominate. It's very easy for people like me to dominate. We have a status. If you have a status of professor or status of expert, you have a long experience of research, then not only may the community partners wish to defer to you, but you yourself may not even realize how you are dominating the process. And the person on the right of the photograph at the bottom there, Kath Carter, who is sadly no longer with us, was one of the community partners in a project I was working on. And she had no hesitation in telling us we were using incomprehensible, inscrutable academic language, and we needed to tone it down and use different terms. And we need people like Kath, I think, to keep pushing us. So that we can hear her views as well. And this was a project on household debt, and she had personal experience as well as being an activist on that topic. So respecting different views, but also being able to challenge oppression if we do experience issues of racism, sexism, and so on. How we handle consent, agreement, ground rules. The consent is not and shouldn't be quite the same as it would be in a research project where we have informants and academic researchers if we have community partners who are all agreeing how to work together. So it's better probably to think of as a working agreement about how we'll work together. And learning how to negotiate roles and boundaries. So I inevitably got involved in campaigning on high interest rates in low income neighbourhoods, and pushing in terms of public meetings, meeting MPs, pushing for changes in legislation. So becoming an activist alongside Kath, who also became a researcher alongside me. So moving between those roles, which can cause some challenges and issues. And the second example I'm going to use comes from the book as well, from the Netherlands. And in fact, both these examples I've used are small examples. These aren't about life or death issues. They're not about sort of lying, truth telling, that they're actually about everyday issues that come up about roles, responsibilities, rights, goods, etc. And here we have a case of a postdoc researcher, Gustav, and a community researcher, Rafaela, who worked on a project to evaluate a program for developing experiential knowledge for people with intellectual disabilities. That's the Dutch term that they're using there. We could say people with learning disabilities. And Gustav had trained Rafaela and another woman to conduct interviews and observations. And Rafaela was a member of an organisation that supported people with intellectual disabilities. And after each observation, the community researchers would hand in reports. And Rafaela asked Gustav to correct her grammatical errors and other mistakes. But Gustav was reluctant, as he saw himself as a co-researcher, not her Dutch language teacher. He felt that people with intellectual disabilities are stigmatized, and correcting language exerts cultural dominance, eradicates tension in interactions between people and researchers with or without learning disabilities. He valued authenticity and would only correct the reports if he couldn't understand them. Raffaella, however, really wanted Gustav to be honest and to adjust her errors because, as she said, I do not want people to consider my writing weird. I would be ashamed if my children would read what I wrote. So that's an interesting dilemma for Gustav. As I say, it's not a huge life or death matter, but it's a matter of relationships. It's a matter of power, responsibility. Gustav wants to advocate for people with learning disabilities being treated for who they are and not being forced to conform to unnecessary cultural norms. That would be an obvious position for an academic researcher in that field to want to take. But Raffaella, living in the world as she does, wants to be seen as someone who can be respected and is conforming to some of the cultural norms, not wanting her children to consider her writing weird. So what do we do? What are some of the issues at stake here? How would that be resolved? And again, I'd be interested to hear your views on that dilemma. And finally, thinking about reporting, which that last example links into, and the kind of outputs. So all the issues about how we present and in what form, and I won't go through all those because I'm sure you're all familiar with all the different formats, but it's about who's involved in the research. And for Raffaella, what would be a good way of reporting the findings? How would it reach the people she wants it to reach? And for Gustav, how is he going to reach people? And how do we do a good mix of academic articles and films, web pages, or whatever? What standards should be used? If we want the research to be credible, to impact policy, then do we also, is that another reason for wanting to tidy up Raffaella's language or not? Who contributes, owns, is acknowledged or anonymized? So does Raffaella want her name on any articles, etc.? The dangers of extractivism, that is, taking people's views, ideas, contributions, even from participatory research, and then putting them into academic articles that those people probably can't read and don't have any control over. So being wary of that. How do we handle controversy? There may be controversy within communities. Within the community that I was working in on trying to get a cap, the results of the research were that we're trying to get a cap on high levels of interest rates on loans. And in effect, if that succeeded, some of the loan companies or the informal lenders might be put out of business, and they may be the only ways in which people who had no other source of money could actually get a loan. So there would be controversy and conflict within the community. And how do we do the campaigning and advocacy? To what extent can or should an academic get involved in campaigning at a political level, and what does that mean? So those are some of the issues that come up, and I'm sure you can add more. And it was because of those kind of issues that we identified actually in 2012, when we did the first edition of this guide to ethical principles, that we decided, a group of us, we had a project which was led by Durham, but it had 3 other universities involved with their community partners from Wales and other parts of the UK. And we had a series of workshops, and we developed these ethical principles and guide to practice. And we did a second edition in 2022. A different group of people were involved in doing that. And that was because we felt in the UK there was a gap. I think there's a much less of a gap now because there's a lot more interest and guidance available, but at the time that wasn't so. And so we identified a set of principles which are very much in line with what I've already been talking about. I'm not going to go through each one of those now, but you can see what they are, and each principle we expand on a little bit, and then we actually develop some guidelines for ethical practice. And it's very difficult in any form of practice, but particularly in this participatory practice, to separate out the practical and the ethical, because every practical thing you do does have an ethical implication, as shown by the case of Gustav and Raffaella. I think, just correcting language when we think about it is about respect or disrespect, responsibility, and so on. So we've got various sections in the guidelines, starting with the preparation. And one of the first things we say is, having a meeting to see, can we work together? Obviously, you don't have to share all the values, but you do have to share enough in terms of what you want to research, why you want to research it. And so developing an agreement, designing the research. And in the second edition, we added in number 6 as a vital element, engaging in ongoing dialogue and ethical reflection. And that's something that often our research ethics committees don't necessarily encourage. It's not that they discourage it, but because it's a kind of process of filling in a form and getting approval, once you've got the approval, then it's tempting just to go ahead, and it's kind of optional as to whether you stop and reflect and see how you're doing in terms of the roles, relationships, and so on. So we recommend building in space for ethical reflection. And we've produced an appendix where the group who was involved collected together some materials that we felt were important. And interestingly, the first 2 were about tips for managing the ethical review process and imagining it as well. And then there's various other things that you can use. Dilemmas cafes is a way of actually doing that ongoing dialogue and reflection. And the final point, which came from a colleague in India, was how to establish community-led ethical review boards. So the communities themselves having a board which would look at the proposed research and give recommendations as to whether it should go ahead or not. And the other thing that I've been involved with for quite a long time, which I'll just mention, is the international collaboration for participatory health research, a bit of a mouthful. We have an ethics working group, and recently we've developed this concept of the ethics co-laboratory. So obviously that's a play on collaboration, but it's all, the laboratory is about testing, rehearsing, exploring some of the ethical issues. So we often bring ethics cases, so like the 2 I gave from the palliative care academic and from the Dutch case, bringing an ethics case and then discussing it in the group. And more recently, we've been trialing different ways of getting engaged with a case. So we've been acting out the case using participatory theatre and people taking different roles. We've done visualization, dancing, creative writing, haiku, and those are really all about us trying to look expansively at what might be going on in this case. Might there be things we haven't thought of? What might be visible, invisible? And doing that in a group of people who come from different parts of the world, some of whom are academics and 1 or 2 of whom are community researchers, expands our ethical horizons. So we might think of ethical issues that perhaps we hadn't thought of, or think of responses and solutions that we might not have thought of ourselves or within our own space in our own universities or community settings. And so we look at issues like the microethics, where do people sit? How do they use their bodies? How do they look at each other? All that gives messages, doesn't it? Relating to respect, compassion, distance, all that kind of stuff. And the important aspects of the meso and macro ethics, the organizational settings. So said quite a bit about universities. but there's also the voluntary sector, the community sector, and they have their own idiosyncrasies and challenges as well. And how do those things impact on the kind of research that can be done, the kind of relationships that can develop, and what's going on round about what you might call the moral ecology? What are some of the norms and assumptions that we need to look at and maybe challenge or work through? And all this is about developing the capacity to do what I call ethics work. That is this idea of stopping, reflecting, looking hard, analysing, having a dialogue, rehearsing what you might do, and talking to other people about it. And I think that is very important in all forms of research and all walks of life, but we often don't have the time to do this. And I think particularly in participatory research, we need to make the time and do what I call slow ethics. I mean, all ethics is slow in a sense because it is about reflection on who you are and what you're doing and why. But slowing down even more and creating that space, I think, is very, very important. So some concluding comments, so I've nearly finished, about the effort of striving to be ethical. So on those 4 areas, you're probably doing some of these, and I'd be really interested to hear what you are actually doing in your university in terms of training for ethics committees, whether applications can be staged, what community representation there is on research ethics committees, and is there any interest in community-based research ethics committees? In terms of reach, the importance of ethical sensitivity, thinking about the implications of working alongside people who've got very different capabilities, needs, norms, aims, etc. Being thoughtful, mindful, seeing how people might be excluded, harmed, and making an effort to reach out. Thinking about relationships, roles, how we develop care, trust, and openness. And if we want to talk in moral philosophical terms, that would be care ethics that focuses on the relationships between people and the responsibilities, and virtue ethics, which is about developing qualities of character strengths in people to be caring, compassionate, just, honest, and above all, doing a power analysis and being aware of our own power and ways in which people need to take power and challenge us as well. And finally, on reporting, being aware that there could be potential harm when we do report research, being aware of tokenism in just adding in a community partner's name, for example, the need for supported inclusion in preparing outputs. If community researchers are going to be involved in writing, curating exhibitions and so on, that needs to be built in, and that process needs to be fair and supported, and people need to be credited in ways that they want to be, which can be quite challenging if some want to be credited and others don't. And thinking about how the work is disseminated to whom, in what way, and so on. And those are all issues that come up in all research, but I think we just have to put a particular lens on when we're thinking about participatory research because of the complexities of the relationships that we have in this form of research. And if any of you are interested in following up from the ICPHR Ethics Working Group, we, having discussed and acted out various cases, we've also written up some of the cases in a particular journal, Ethics and Social Welfare. And our usual model is to write a sort of description of a case, and then several people write commentaries from different perspectives. And we find that very interesting and useful because it's really good to get different angles, and different people come up with different ideas and analyses. And finally, the final slide, which I seem to have lost now. That doesn't matter. I don't know whether that's gone. But it was just with the links to the Centre for Social Justice and Community Action website, which I can send to you afterwards. So that is the end of the slideshow, and I'll stop sharing and we can invite questions now.